last week, we discussed Hans Holbein the Younger and Anthony van Dyck, both court portraitists to kings of England, to Charles I and Henry VIII, and both major influences on English portraiture for the next century. Today, we'll look at Joshua Reynolds, Sir Joshua Reynolds, a central character in British portraiture and artistic life in the mid-18th century. Like William Hogarth, Reynolds was the ambitious son of a middle-class person, a schoolmaster, and would have preferred being an apothecary rather than an ordinary painter. In other words, he was extremely ambitious to rise above the class to which he was born. In your reading by Pevsner, you read the author compare these two self-portraits. So we'll just talk for a moment about the differences between Hogarth and Sir Joshua Reynolds in these two, both really incredible self-portraits. On the one hand, there's composition. Joshua Reynolds uses a kind of Baroque device, an extreme light source, casting much of the painting in shadow, a kind of dynamic diagonal created between the artist and a sculpture, versus the kind of classic triangulation between Hogarth, his painting palette, and his dog. Hogarth, you remember, associates himself with contemporary literature, literally placing his self-image upon the pedestal of literature, the books underneath him. Reynolds, on the other hand, associates himself with classical sculpture, right? White marble sculpture in the classical tradition. Hogarth's dog, as you remember, this ugly little pug, makes a very British claim. He's showing a kind of national identity through the breed of this dog. Reynolds, on the other hand, is showing himself in quite an Italian light, making associations between the Italian Renaissance, both in his costume and through this classicizing sculpture. Hogarth, you remember, this is quite an unflattering view of both artist and pug. He shows his wrinkles, his scars, doesn't make himself too beautiful, nor his dog. But Reynolds shows a more idealized kind of portrait with smoother skin, the sort of a beautiful outfit, the kind of rougher spots smoothed out. So this represents two very different philosophies on portraiture in the 18th century. In order to launch more deeply into the work of Sir Joshua Reynolds, we'll also use this comparison as a kind of starting point. And here on the left, of course, you see Hogarth's one of the final scenes from A Harlot's Progress from 1731. And then on the right is a painting we're going to spend a little bit more time with in a moment, Sir Joshua Reynolds's Lady Talbot of 1780. So let's just compare and contrast these two for a moment. Hogarth, of course, is appealing to lower members of the art-consuming public, right? He's presenting high contrasts, a black and white image, a scene representing the sort of shades of passion. There's death, there's prostitution, there's theft, there's child neglect here. So the subject matter is quite dramatic and appeals to kind of both low sensibilities and strikes a moralizing tone. Hogarth's work, you remember, is extremely nationalistic. It wants to create, Hogarth aimed to create a specifically British form for the visual arts. And this included the incorporation of satire, which was a very strong component of the British literary tradition. Hogarth also believed, and you remember from that serpentine line on his artist palette in the previous image, he believed in truth to observation, right? Not idealizing so much. And Hogarth is also committed to topicality, in other words, to presenting contemporary subjects, right? He's not going back in history. He's trying to show, even if it's a kind of, storyboard, the foibles and ills of contemporary life. And he is a man for details, right? You have paintings and prints packed with detail in order to give you your money's worth, right? In order to provide entertainment and information and sort of layers for the viewer. Reynolds, on the other hand, wants to strike a tone of universality. He wants to present and appeal to the higher ideals of his audience. So he's not showing you child neglect and syphilitic sores. He wants to edify, find a kind of idealized moral story. He favors classicism, as I think you can see. He studied the so-called great masters, traveling to Italy, which became quite the fashion for educated young men to do in the 18th century. And you can see, right, he's showing kind of classical sculptures, a kind of Grecian dress on Lady Talbot, objects and sceneries from his continental voyage, his Italian voyage. Reynolds will also have an international influence because of his claims to universality and classicism. He claims to favor simplicity, again, over the kind of proliferation of details we see in Hogarth. He said form is superior to color, as idea is to incident. So he's trying to communicate kind of one idea, although there are different details to parse in this painting. But he wants to communicate one idea, not the kind of layered, multi-pronged stories of a Hogarth print. I should also point out, of course, that we're looking at two different media here, right? Hogarth does make paintings, as you saw, but he's really making his money and reputation off of his prints, which are made on paper. They're affordable. They're also more broadly seen, whether in the window of a print shop, which people would crowd around, or something that you bought and owned in your house. Reynolds is, of course, operating in with the traditionally revered medium of oil on canvas. So this is a singular object that would require a privileged position to be seen. These two artists did share a commitment to description of contemporary people. Joshua Reynolds advocated for history painting, which was the highest genre, the most respected genre in the Royal Academy, an institution that we'll discuss. History painting are multi-figure paintings, so we're not seeing that Reynolds painting that here. A multi-figure painting usually representing the historical past or a mythological subject or even a biblical subject. So he believed in the importance of history painting, but in his own practice, he's a portraitist almost exclusively. So he's painting people living in the time that he's in. Both artists took seriously the social responsibility of art. On the left, I'm reminding you of Hogarth's Gin Lane, right? And the kind of seriousness with which Hogarth approached the contemporary social and public health ills of his day. We'll see this too in Reynolds. So Reynolds' career, he began with an apprenticeship with one of the most fashionable painters of his day, Thomas Hudson, and then he set off on an independent practice in the early 1750s. Um, uh, in addition to taking a grand tour through Italy, as I discussed. Again, this was very fashionable to do, just as backpacking through Europe kind of offers young people a cultural cachet today, or studying abroad. So too did it in the 18th century. If you had been a young nobleman, and they were all men in the 18th century, you would have completed your cultural edification with a period of European travel. And this so-called grand tour, which is capitalized, the G and the T, could last anywhere from a few months to 8 years. So this is sort of where young men grew up. But as you can imagine, only the very wealthy and those young gentlemen with the time and the means to travel could go. So this was a class thing. And the most exciting destination on the Grand Tour was Italy. And a highlight attraction on the Italian part of the trip was seeing ancient Roman monuments. Pompeii and the neighboring site Herculaneum were rediscovered and excavated in the 1730s and 40s. So Pompeii, an archaeological site that you probably know even today, it was discovered, it was sort of unearthed in 1748, so just before Reynolds would have gone on his tour of Italy. Very exciting stuff. So here you see an etching from 1776, where a temple at Pompeii, the Temple of Isis, is being unearthed. And you can see little figures, right, digging out the hardened lava, carting it out in baskets and wheelbarrows, in the slow excavation process of these towns that were buried during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the 1st century AD. So this is two towns frozen in time, right? Incredibly preserved Roman vacation towns, essentially, seaside towns. And just really blew people's minds. It's still incredible to have the resources from Pompeii and Herculaneum today, and it's still, of course, a site of interest today. But imagine going in 1750, a young Joshua Reynolds, and seeing, right, these columns, these sculptures, these objects being discovered, right, in the moments that you are visiting. So this discovery of new art in these archaeological sites sparked a new appreciation and vogue for ancient Roman artifacts. There wasn't such a craze for ancient material, classical material, since the Renaissance. And this turn to classicism would influence art throughout 18th century Europe. Mount Vesuvius was one of the popular destinations of the Grand Tour, and again, you could see this stuff happening. Upon returning from Italy in 1753, Reynolds rapidly established himself as one of the leading portrait painters in London. For 30 years, the first half of George III's reign, from 1760 to 1790, he was the unchallenged authority in portraiture. In 1760, we'll see Reynolds' sort of official position challenged, but he did quite well for himself. In 1760, he moved to a grand house in Leicester Fields, the heart of fashionable London, started living in a style rarely seen amongst painters. His most important professional success was his election to become the president of the Royal Academy. In other words, the most prestigious institution for the training of artists and the exhibition of arts in Britain when it was founded. So he was the president of this important institution when it was founded in 1768. By 1782, he was charging an unprecedented amount, 200 guineas, for a full-length portrait. This was more than twice the cost of a portrait by his nearest rival, Thomas Gainsborough, who we'll talk about next meeting. Now, Gainsborough arrived in London in 1774 after a successful career in the English provinces, outside of London, in other words. George III, the king, actually had a distaste for Joshua Reynolds. This might have been a kind of personal issue rather than a stylistic issue. And George II, his predecessor, preferred the subtleties and sensitivities of Ramsay, who he appointed court painter in 1760, and Gainsborough. Reynolds only became the official court painter. This is like the top artist who was actually hired by the king in 1784 upon Ramsay's death, when his appointment was almost unavoidable because of his professional preeminence. So here's one of the portraits that made Reynolds' name. This is a portrait of Commodore Keppel from 1753-1754. Keppel was a sailor who offered Reynolds free passage to Italy on his ship. Again, Reynolds went to Italy to study the old masters and classical tradition, and painted this portrait of Keppel upon his return as a thanks, right, for the passage. Now, this canvas remained in Reynolds' studio for 17 years, not because it was a failure, but because he saw it as being so successful, it acted as a kind of demonstration piece for potential clients. So if you were interested in getting your portrait done, you could go to his studio and see something like this and say, oh, I want to look as dynamic, right, as this, as Keppel does here. So here we see Keppel striding, right? He's in motion, striding along a seashore in a commanding pose. Reynolds does idealize his sitter. As I'll show you on the next slide, he compares Keppel to the ancient statue, the Apollo Belvedere, then visible in the Vatican Museum in Rome. So here I'm showing you this comparison where Reynolds clearly adopts the pose of the Apollo Belvedere for his portrait of Commodore Keppel. So this demonstrates a broader habit of Reynolds basing the poses in his portraits off of ancient sculpture or old master paintings, so you can sort of hunt out the references. Now, the Apollo Belvedere, you might be familiar with if you've taken other art history classes, particularly in ancient or Renaissance art. It was a sculpture that was rediscovered in Italy in the late 15th century, so during the Italian Renaissance. From the mid-18th century, it was considered to be the greatest ancient sculpture by ardent neoclassicists. So during this new craze for classical art in the 18th century, inspired by those archaeological discoveries, there was this new and very fervent appreciation for this sculpture in particular. And it was said to really epitomize the ideals of aesthetic perfection for Western parts of the world. So the idealized description of musculature, the kind of dynamism, the real technical feat of creating a sculpture with this balance, right? Balancing these outstretched limbs, this one leg pushed back and just resting on a toe, the symmetrical and idealized features. This was just seen to be the kind of epitome of classical beauty for 18th century viewers. And we see the same pose, right? You can see that leg pushed back and resting on a toe, the outstretched arm, the face turned sideways in Reynolds' portrait of Keppel. This also helped solve the contradiction between Reynolds' theoretical elevation of history painting, again, that large format multi-figure paintings of classical history or mythology, and his lucrative portrait practice, as the author Pevsner discusses. Reynolds' theoretical program was articulated primarily in a series of lectures he delivered to the students of the Royal Academy when he became president. So his discourses, which I've spelled for you in the top right of this slide, are sort of transcriptions of these lectures, which he delivered between 1769 and 1790, and lay out his sort of theoretical priorities and programs. And here I've given you a quotation from one of his lectures here. He says, "If an exact resemblance of an individual be considered as the sole object to be aimed at, the portrait painter will be apt to lose more than he gains by the acquired dignity taken from general nature. It is very difficult to ennoble the character of a countenance, but at the expense of a likeness, which is what is most generally required by such as to sit to the painter." So he believed that one should ennoble their sitters. One should make them more noble, that a likeness, an exact likeness of a person's face should not be the goal necessarily of portraiture, but instead, right, dignity and idealization should be part of the goal, even at the expense of sort of, smoothing out, filtering, or putting a filter on, we would say, the likeness of a sitter. Reynolds believed that classical art, like the Apollo Belvedere, was based on an appreciation of the laws of nature. And he applied his commitment to classicism to the genre of portraiture. Reynolds, like Hogarth, was connected to the literary world. His close friend was Edmund Burke, an author who helped him write his discourses. He was also quite close with the actor and writers Garrick and Johnson. And we see in Reynolds a flair for the dramatic, for a kind of theatrical presentation in his portraits. Look at Commodore Keppel here. He's striding with really dramatic storm clouds gathering above him. The sea behind him is rough, right? This is stormy, showing the unpredictability, the theatricality of nature here. And the style, this highlighted body and sort of dramatic shadows, was influenced by artists like Rembrandt, also the Venetians. So the tone, the use of chiaroscuro, lended weight to his work. So he's drawing upon the old masters in ways that Hogarth would refuse to. And let's think a little bit more about this reference to the Apollo Belvedere. While Reynolds shared some of the theoretical aims of the neoclassicists and often adopted antique and Renaissance poses for his sitters, he rarely executed in a classical style. So again, drawing more upon the Baroque flair for drama. His paintings exemplified the everyday, immediate nature of the status and power of his sitters as well. And he glorified members of the land-owning class, those entitled to bear arms, to wear swords, including a large number of military heroes um, who distinguished themselves in battle or administration during the 7 Years' War, which took place during the mid-18th century here. And we see this in Keppel as well. Here's two more military figures. The portrait of Lord Admiral Anson and General John Burgoyne, pardon me. You see that he's painting these two military figures in full dress uniform, placing them quite unusually against a dramatic background vignette attesting to their heroism. On the right, you can see a battle beneath the hand and sword of the general. The smoke from the battle is drifting up, sort of blending in with the dramatic storm clouds. At left, again, we have sort of weather standing in for the drama of unleashed natural forces. And I should say the figure at left, Lord Anson, was a mentor of Corporal Keppel, who we saw Reynolds had that personal relationship with. Reynolds was interested in showing the sort of immediacy of power, the power of these figures, exploiting color and using, for what was at the time, pretty dashing brushstrokes in order to emphasize the show of their temporal power, their power in their careers, their power on Earth. And just to think about these brushstrokes, we'll see Gainsborough become much more brushy than Reynolds. But if you think about Reynolds in contrast to Holbein, right, the brushstrokes are much more expressive, especially in the backgrounds, much looser. And Reynolds is, in contrast to Holbein and Hogarth, much more interested in this dramatic chiaroscuro. Reynolds was not always rigorously classical, but he did set modern figures into antique poses and costumes, as you see here with Lady Sarah Bunbury sacrificing to the Graces from 1763 to 1765. This is a pose borrowed from classical relief, which I'll show you on the next slide. So the pose of the figures is borrowed from something like this, and this is an image at right from the early Roman period, the 2nd century, the Common Era, 3 goddesses of fortune. This relief was known since the 18th century and belonged in the Borghese collections in Rome, still a fabulous collection of both Baroque and ancient art in Rome. And here we see 3 figures. We see the frontal presentation of the body, even as the women are gesturing to their sides. So we're getting a sort of 3/4 look at, or even frontal look at these women's bodies, even as the Roman sculptor is weaving them together in this interaction here. And so too with Reynolds' Lady Sarah Bunbury. Her face being in profile and her body being presented almost frontally looks like the arrangement in a classical relief. The presence of a servant behind her pouring libations speaks to Lady Sarah's actual social position, so her modern 18th century British social position, the ability to have that servant. And Reynolds created this painting and exhibited it 9 years later. This is an important contrast between male and female sitters in Reynolds' oeuvre or body of work that we can draw a contrast from and that Wilton points out in your text. Male sitters could be presented on their own, right, showing their jobs or careers or ranks, whether they would be lawyers or generals or statesmen, politicians. So Reynolds is interested in showing their public identities, their public selves. Women, in contrast, did not have the same career opportunities or public lives as men in the 18th century. Their role, according to social constructs, was to bear children and to act as ornaments for their husbands. So Reynolds dresses them up in costumes from mythology or history, as goddesses or nymphs or Vestal virgins. In this way, he's showing some of their virtues or attributes, but this also puts them at a remove, right? Showing them at a distance from public life, not participating in public life, but in this kind of other realm. They're placed, as Sarah Bunbury is here, in the kind of distance of time, or in the unthreatening costume of a pagan goddess, in order that they're removed from being actors, right, in their own moments. This is the case also in Reynolds' The Adorning of a Term of Hymen with Festoons of Flowers from 1773. This painting was commissioned by Luke Gardner, an MP or a politician, soon to marry the daughter of a Scottish jurist. And he wanted a representation of his fiancée and her two sisters in the form of, and this is a quote given to Reynolds, some emblematical or historical subject. Gardner was intent on elevating them and distinguishing the family for posterity, something that was flattering for Reynolds to hear with this painting's commission, right? This Gardner is thinking about future viewers, right? Generations after this painting is constructed. And Reynolds appreciated the opportunity to introduce a variety of postures and expressions with these three subjects. In fact, he stuffs the picture plane with art objects, with furniture, a carpet you can see under the feet of the center figure, with ram's heads, sort of a bunch of bric-a-brac associated with neoclassicism, or this revival of classical art and objects. And these women are placed as if they are participating in a pagan rite of fertility, which in Reynolds' hands is transformed into a respectable bridal allegory, right? Fertility is a good subject for a bride. Reynolds standardized his approach to portraiture on a large scale and volume. Already in 1759, he had 150 sitters and was employing considerable studio help to map out the main compositions and accessories of his somewhat formulaic three-quarter length portraits. Three-quarter length means that we see about three-quarters of their body, which, as you can see in the slides before this, is pretty standard in his practice. By most accounts, his sitters were poorly paid and badly compensated, barely sharing the high prices he charged. Reynolds became the most successful portraitist in the country and bought a second house, which he also staffed and filled with a vast art collection of old master paintings. He used his position as the president of the Royal Academy to advise wealthy collectors, and he served as their agent, which was something, of course, he charged for. This is, art advising and connoisseurship is still a skill you can get paid for. He also dealt in pictures and statuary directly. So, like Hogarth, uh, Reynolds, who you remember came similarly from a middle class background, right? Both had school teachers for fathers. Both maximized the commercial potential of their position in the art world. Reynolds even set up an ornate coach, which he used as a form of advertising, sort of advertising his artistic services. His sister would take it as often as possible to give a strong indication of his great success. So he was pretty sophisticated on the commercial side of things too, as with Hogarth. And that economic story is a story we often need to tell in art history. Now, the sitter of this portrait, Anne Dashwood, is the daughter of Sir James Dashwood, a member of Parliament for Oxford. She sat for Reynolds 4 times in the month preceding her marriage, which took place on June 13th, 1764, to John Stuart, Lord Garlies, later 7th Earl of Galloway. We'll hear a lot of these long titles in this class. You don't need to pay much attention to them. Reynolds presents this young woman, and it's pretty typical to have a portrait done on the occasion of one's wedding. The artist presents her in the traditional guise of a shepherdess with a crook. You can see that sort of staff that she holds in her left hand. But she's wearing quite a fashionable gauze scarf and rubies and pearls, which would be something very unlike the accessories of a shepherdess. So this is a woman in a costume, right? Playing at being part of the humble peasantry that was part of a wider trend in the 1780s. And I'll show you the next slide, which is just something utterly fascinating to me, and who specializes in French art. This is, if you don't know it, it's called the Queen's Hamlet. It's a small sort of shack, and I use that term sort of loosely, situated on the grounds of Versailles, right, the King's Palace in France. Marie Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI in France in the 1780s, constructed this little hamlet and a kind of small little Disneyland town around it. Again, on the grounds at Versailles. You can leave the Palace of Versailles, walk a little distance, and come upon this little hamlet. And she did this in order to play at being a shepherdess. She wore the dress of a little shepherdess, so she wore a kind of costume. She pretended to sort of play in this house where she was surrounded by sheep and ducks, which you can kind of see in the print. I know it's a little fuzzy at right. And so this is part of a trend at the aristocratic classes play acting, right, or pretending at being, at embracing this sort of humble, virtuous, and in their minds, simpler career or life. So here we see Anne Dashwood doing the same, right? Playing at being a shepherdess, although giving clues with those rubies and pearls to her real identity, right, and to her real place in society on the eve of her wedding. We also see, again, very typical for Reynolds, classicizing architectural elements, right? You have this sort of big, perhaps kind of tomb that she's resting on with classical figures. On the right-hand side of the canvas, you have that dramatic sky that should be very emblematic of Reynolds to you. And just a note before we leave this painting behind that she has a real ghostly pallor, right? Her skin looks sort of dreadfully bluish white. And that's not necessarily due to the fact that she is a British woman of the 18th century, but the paint may have faded a little bit. So her skin tone, we think, or conservators think, has been exaggerated and cooled over time just because of the pigments that Reynolds used for this painting. So returning to Lady Talbot, what do we see here? How would we describe and analyze this portrait? Well, it's a full-length portrait. And if you were to see the canvas in real life, you would know that it's a life-size portrait. So it's an enormous canvas that really has a kind of physical presence in front of the viewer. This is, like most of Reynolds' subjects, a contemporary sitter, right? This is a woman, an aristocrat, who commissioned her portrait. But she's shown, of course, in a costume evocative of the ancient world. She's shown in a flowing white dress trimmed with gold, with a semi-transparent gold wrap over her shoulders and around her arms. Her hair has been powdered white and is dressed high in the current fashion. Remember, this is the 1780s. This is exactly what was in vogue. And she's posed holding a small plate or dish before her with her left hand and lightly touching a tall, narrow chalice with her outstretched white hand. This vessel is set on one corner of a low smoking tripod of standard antique form. Some way behind this to the left is a high plinth with a sculpture of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. The narrative suggestion is that the sitter has poured a libation of oil onto the burning coals as a form of sacrifice and tribute to the goddess. Again, the goddess of wisdom and the arts. The richly textured painted surface and striking gold color scheme of golds and reds and creams contrasts with the blue of the sky. And this painter's palette recalls the works of the Venetian Renaissance painter Titian. So again, Reynolds is embedding references to continental painting, to old master painting in his work. And remember that Reynolds wanted his portraits to be esteemed as a form of painting that was as artistically ambitious and interesting as the work of such universally admired masters as Titian. This painting is believed to have been included in among the 15 works that Reynolds showed as part of the very popular and well-attended annual exhibition of contemporary British art at the Royal Academy in London in 1782. Remember, that's the same institution that he had been president of. And I say believed because art historians think that it was shown as an unidentified portrait of a lady, and have sort of deduced that the painting you see in front of you was cataloged as Portrait of a Lady. The sitter, however, is certainly, art historians have determined, Lady Charlotte Talbot, who was born Charlotte Hill, the third daughter of Wills Hill, the first Marquess of Downshire, and his wife, Margaret Fitzgerald, who had married the third Lord of Talbot. Again, you don't have to take down notes on all of these landed titles. The portrait was painted in the second half of 1780 or 1781 when Reynolds recorded appointments with Lady Charlotte Talbot at his London studio. So this is part of the research work that some art historians do to sort of date works and find their sitters. He may have continued to work on this massive canvas, however, through 1782 before receiving payment in July of that year. A mezzotint reproduction of this artwork was published in May of 1782 while the Royal Academy exhibition was ongoing. And so there was presumably this attempt to exploit the public display of the painting as a means for securing sales of the print. And a mezzotint is a print made from an engraved copper or steel plate. And this process of Reynolds selling prints based on the reputation of popular paintings should remind you of Hogarth, right? These are artists trying to find a way to profit on their enterprises and to market themselves to a broader audience to potentially get more clients for canvases. So, as the art historian Mark Hallett notes in relaying some of this information, these prints ensured that Reynolds' paintings of contemporary aristocrats circulated well beyond the realms of aristocratic society and included images that played an active role in the visual and celebrity culture in contemporary London. So a print of this painting would act in a way like a People or an Us magazine cover, where sort of common people would delight in reading about and learning about the lives of the extremely wealthy. This painting also appears to have been commissioned by the first Earl of Talbot as a pair to an existing portrait of him by the Italian artist Pompeo Battoni, which now lives in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, which you'll see on the next slide. Talbot commissioned this portrait from Battoni while he was on his grand tour to Europe in 1773. And so, matching Lady Talbot's Minerva, you see in John Talbot's portrait a famous classical sculpture known as the Ludovisi Mars, which lives at the National Museum in Rome, representing masculine martial values. So this little sculpture emphasizing martial or military values is paired when Reynolds creates a kind of pendant portrait with the more feminine virtue of wisdom here. So these were meant to live together. Reynolds knew about Battoni's portrait when he was creating the portrait of his bride, Lady Talbot. But they're not exactly the same, right? Their costumes are quite different. Characteristically of grand portraiture in the 18th century, the male sitter is posed in a contemporary costume, while, once again, the woman is playfully presented in a form of historicizing fancy dress or costume. Also typical are the circumstances surrounding the commissioning of these portraits. That the man initiated this portrait during his grand tour to commemorate his youth and this important moment in his life, and that his wife commissioned her portrait in the early years of their marriage, sort of two milestones in their lives that they wanted to commemorate in this way. So we can see Reynolds' portrait as underscoring conventional gender identities among the social elite. Men were associated with public virtues and contemporary responsibilities, while women were treated more fancifully and excised from contemporary public life. Reynolds, of course, builds upon the reputation and portrait strategies of Anthony van Dyck, who preceded him and who we've discussed. So here we're seeing Reynolds's portrait of Captain George Koosmaker from 1783, and you remember on the left Van Dyck's Charles I at the Hunt from 1635. So Van Dyck still has this incredible legacy 2 centuries after he was working. So when we compare these two, how are they similar? How is Reynolds drawing from Van Dyck? And how is his, in terms of his composition, but also his technical processes? And we can see Reynolds's portrait at the right as really something of a technical experimentation for the artist. He had an unusually large number of sittings for this portrait. So he asked the captain back again and again. There was even multiple sittings for the horse. He wanted to get that horse just right. And the horse, of course, is a direct reference in its position to the Van Dyck. You can see that kind of rhyming there. And again, unusually, Reynolds likely painted this portrait of the captain entirely on his own and without the help of assistants. It was very common at this time period for an artist to have assistants sort of fill in a lot of the background. You wouldn't give your assistants the job of creating the portrait's face or even the finer details of their costume. But they could do things like, paint the urns, paint the pillars, sort of do the grunt work. And that was considered to be absolutely acceptable in these days. But this Reynolds wanted to do on his own. And there's a particular kind of verve and fluency that you see in this painting, a liveliness and a looseness with the brushstrokes. Especially, I want you to look at the tree that he's clearly patterning after Van Dyck in the background here. So something of an experimentation inspired by Van Dyck. This painting of Lady Bamfield has been dated using a pocketbook or a notebook that Sir Joshua Reynolds kept, where art historians have discovered he noted an appointment with the Lady Bamfield, in April 1777, less than 2 weeks before the present canvas was exhibited at the Royal Academy. Presumably he would have worked on this in 1776 as well, as these portraits took quite a while before their public exhibition. Catherine More, the woman in the portrait, was the eldest of 4 daughters of an admiral. She married Charles Warwick Bamfield, who was the eldest son of a member of Parliament for Exeter and Devon in 1776. Several months after her marriage, her husband succeeded his father as the 5th Baronet. So this is an aristocratic family, a landed family, and the present portrait was probably commissioned, as many that we have seen, to celebrate the couple's marriage. Lady Bamfield is dressed in flowing white draperies in her bosom, and this might be hard to see on your screen. She wears a pansy. In her right hand is pointing down toward a massive white lily, which is a time-honored emblem of purity. Again, a very apt quality or virtue to emphasize in a young bride. The lily is framed against a stone pedestal. This is very typical of Reynolds, upon which she rests her left arm. Below on the ground are daisies and a little pink dahlia. Lady Bamfield's pose is the interesting thing about this portrait and the reason we're discussing it. Her right arm extends across her torso toward that lily. Her left arm is placed on the stone plinth, and this is a kind of witty adaptation of a very famous classical statue, which you see on the right, the Venus de Medici, a classical sculpture owned by the Medici family in Italy, but with this pose reversed. In the classical statue, the goddess's hands are positioned over her breasts and genitalia. This was a very common pose for the goddess Venus. And this emphasized at the same time her modesty, right? She's covering up, but also drawing viewers to her sexuality and sexual potency. So here, Reynolds has slightly lowered her left arm. It's no longer covering her breasts explicitly, while her right arm is gesturing, right, not covering, and casts a kind of artful shadow across the area of the figure's lower torso. So this is Lady Bamfield is not represented in classical dress, right, as a goddess, as Fortune, or as a nymph. But the classical reference is drawn through her pose, and she is taken out of a contemporary context of contemporary society. We don't see her, right, sitting at a desk amongst her books, or an admiral, right, striding across the seashore. She's placed in this kind of idealized forest, an idealized landscape. So excising her from public life and contemporary life in much the same way as um, her sisters in portraiture who have been turned into goddesses. And this playful reference to the Venus de Medici again emphasizes her beauty and her virtue, which Venus was known for, but this was also part of the pleasure of viewing portraits. If you were part of the social elite, you would have been on the grand tour, presumably. You would know these sort of classical references if you were educated in the higher strata of society. So there would be this sort of added pleasure, this added benefit of that elite education when you were viewing portraits like Reynolds.